Commissioner Martens, good morning.
Good morning.
I have a few questions for you. Can you tell us, in your statement that you just had, there wasn't any mention, can you tell us what the status is on the health impact studies that are being done and the final SGIS report with regards to high-volume hydraulic fracturing?
Yes, I'll just reiterate what Commissioner Shah said last week, which is he is conducting a health review of our supplemental generic environmental impact statement, and it ought to be completed in a few weeks.
And then when that particular report is completed, then that'll be added to the final SGIS report. Is that completed as of yet?
It's not completed until we hear back from Commissioner Shah. When we do, that will be added to the SGIS.
Okay.
On a different subject, does the proposed budget include any funding related to the authorization of hydrofracking, such as increased permit revenue or increased staff levels?
No, it does not.
So does the absence of that funding mean that the department does not plan to finalize the SGIS and/or issue permits during the coming fiscal year?
It is really up in the air. The Department of Health should be getting back to us shortly on its review of the SGIS. So it was premature in our judgment to include funds when we weren't at the end of the process.
Well, you have a couple of deadlines coming up in February. Do you anticipate an ability to meet those deadlines if the health department hasn't submitted its study?
It all depends on what the health review says. If it recommends additional measures, then it would be difficult to finalize and get the regulations finalized. So it really depends on what the Commissioner Shah recommends to the department.
Do you, given that fact, I'm wondering if you are willing then to consider the results of a new University of Pennsylvania study on the issue, which is going to investigate and analyze reports of health problems near fracking operations in Pennsylvania. Is that something that, or let me ask, is that not information that we should have before things are finalized?
It's, you know, we consider every study, any new information that comes down the pike, and it seems on this issue that it almost does daily. I think the University of Pennsylvania study is not fully funded yet, so I'm not sure what the timetable is for that. I know a lot of universities have agreed to participate, but I think there is still an open issue about timing and funding. But it's certainly one we're going to watch carefully.
Okay, well, I know I understand and appreciate that comment, but and I mentioned that one in particular only because it is taking place. It's an independent study that's taking place in a state that has experience with hydrofracking. And therefore, it seems to me that having the information from that study would be a valuable thing before we make any decisions on what we want to do. Would it not?
It's, as I said, we watch these studies very carefully regardless. I mean, the EPA study is still coming forward. We hope that you know, we get some interim information back from EPA on that study as well, and we actually have 2 DEC staff that are participating in that as designees for the agency.
Good morning, Commissioner. How are you?
Good, Senator. How are you?
You know, I appreciate the relationship that we've had as the ranker of the Environmental Conservation Committee in the Senate. And I think you've been doing a great job, except for the issue of hydrofracking, and that's what I really want to concentrate on.
Excuse me, just for the record, I think everybody sitting in this room knows where you stand on this issue. And it just is going to slow down the process, and everybody wants to hear what the speakers have to say to the questions that are asked. Thank you very much.
Commissioner, if you can go through once again for me when you anticipate coming out with the SGIS final and the health impact assessment analysis.
We are not on any particular timetable. I am waiting for the report from Dr. Shah, which I asked for, and which I understand he is getting close to completing. So when we get that report, we have to evaluate it. And obviously, that is the first thing we'll do. The potential health impacts and Dr. Shah and the Department of Health's opinion about, what we've done in the SGIS is critical, or I wouldn't have asked Dr. Shah to do this separate review. We worked very closely with the Department of Health throughout the process, so it's not as if this was the first time they've done a review, but lots of people, needless to say, around the state, health professionals raised concerns about the adequacy of the SGIS, so they've taken a closer look. They turned to 3 outside experts in the field from 3 prestigious universities. So I'm looking forward to Dr. Shah's report. We should have it in a few weeks, and then we'll decide where we go from there.
I want to get back to that, but first I want to ask a related question. So everybody was under the understanding that the SGIS would be done in February. So are you saying that is not happening?
I have to wait until I get the health report before we make any decisions about whether we move forward or not.
Okay. So let's go back to the health impact assessment. What exactly are these 3 scientists looking at?
They looked at the SGEIS, the entire document. Everything was available to them. We had summarized for them the parts of the SGIS that applied to public health issues. So we summarized that for them, but they basically looked at the entire SGIS.
How many pages in the SGIS actually relate to health impacts?
I don't know off the top of my head. I mean, the
because-
document is several thousand pages, but
But the whole document is.
Right.
But I mean, some of us feel that there was actually no health impact assessment in the SGIS. So that in effect,
Excuse me, I just want you to know that the time you're clapping is eliminated from the time the good senator asks questions. What I said was, if you didn't hear it, the time in which you're clapping takes time away from the questioner, who obviously you want to have ask questions. Thank you.
thank you, Senator. So my concern is that you've asked the Department of Health to look at those components of the SGIS which related to health, which was nothing, and you've asked the scientists to look at that as well, and they're reviewing nothing. I think there's probably many members of the Senate and the Assembly who have been asking for a health impact assessment, an independent health impact assessment that would really, truly look at this issue. My concern is, and you can respond, that these 3 scientists who are well-known and qualified are looking at nothing. So they're going to come back with a report saying there's no problem because there's no data, there's no scientific evidence in the SGIS for them to look at.
I would I disagree with your characterization that there's no health impact review in the SGIS. I would argue that most of the SGIS is a health impact review and addresses health impacts, the potential health impacts to both health and the environment. We identified, if you read the document in Chapter 6, I believe it is, we identified all the potential impacts, adverse impacts, and it was not exclusive to the environment. It included public health impacts. We listed all the potential chemicals that could be used in the process. And then the approach was to see if we could identify specific mitigation measures, which is in Chapter 7, that would prevent public exposure, human exposure, to the chemicals that are used in the process. And not just chemicals, but there was lots of other impacts associated with HVHF, clearing land, runoff. We address it from beginning to end. So the SGIS was very comprehensive. It did look at health impacts. And we asked the experts, these 3 experts from the outside, not just to look at the SGIS, but tell us if there were things we missed. So if they think we missed things, I'm sure they'll be included in Dr. Shah's report.
I'm glad you said that, but I wasn't here for Dr. Shah's testimony, but I don't think that's what he indicated, that they had the opportunity to suggest things that were missed. So, it seems that DEC is punting back to health, and health is punting back to DEC. So I think there needs to be a little clarification as to, and I'd like something in writing following up this meeting, if that is in fact the case, that the 3 scientists and the review can actually suggest things that were missed. And I just wanted to pick up also on your comment about mitigation. I would think when you do a health impact study, you would look at, is this the proper way to go to begin with, and then if it is, what mitigation is necessary. It's sort of like you put the cart before the horse, saying, you're already going to go ahead with this, and now you're going to look at how you can mitigate the possible health impacts. I would think that's the wrong way to go.
I'm not sure I follow you.
In other words, you've already made a decision. Based upon what you just said to me, you've already made a decision that no matter what the health impacts are, we're going to find ways to mitigate it, rather than should we do this based upon the possible health impacts.
I think exactly the opposite. I think we identify the potential adverse impacts, and we explore whether or not they can be mitigated. And we proposed a lot of mitigation measures. I asked Dr. Shaw to look and see whether they agreed that the measures we proposed are adequate, or if we missed any. And we did ask that question. And that's what the question that was asked of the experts. Did we miss things? Were there impacts to public health that we did not address in the SGIS? So I think we fundamentally disagree about the approach.
We definitely fundamentally
There was no foregone conclusions in this process.
2 other questions, if I have time left. One, has there been any effort to identify any seismic impacts
Yes.
that hydrofracking can cause? And where is that?
The New York City in particular raised lots of questions about the potential seismic impacts of fracking on the water supply tunnels, and we hired an outside independent expert to look at that issue. We obviously looked at, outside reports that have been done about incidences in Ohio, incidences in England where seismic impacts have occurred. So we've looked at them, and we've had an outside consultant look at them as well.
Is that coming out? I haven't seen anything like that. I'd like to see a copy of what you've been able to ascertain.
It's in the next draft that we've been working on.
In the next draft. Mm-hmm. Now, the updated SGIS was released in December, if I remember correctly. Prior to that, you had received about 80,000 comments, and it took you a year to analyze those 80,000 comments. And I understand there's about 200,000 comments that have come in since December.
Right.
How are you handling reviewing those 200,000 comments?
It's kept people very busy.
Well, if it took you, what's your time frame? I mean, again, going back to that February deadline, which apparently is not a deadline, but it took you a year to do 80,000 comments, and now there are 200,000 comments. So
there's 200,000 comments. I don't know how many of them are both germane to the what we were seeking comments on. It was just the regulations that we proposed. Some of them obviously are just repetitive comments. So there's lots of comments, and staff is literally working on responding to those comments right now, and lots of staff are working on them.
Liz, question, absolutely. Will the health impact assessment that you're doing, or analysis, be open to the public, and will it be the public have an opportunity to comment?
When it's released, I'm sure it will be made available to the public.
And an opportunity for the public to comment?
We'll have to see when we get it. But it will be made available to the public, and I'm sure that people will comment on it, whether there's a formal comment period or not.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Yep.
Thank you all. Enjoy.
With regard to fracking, I mean, agriculture is the largest industry in this state, and the dairy industry is a big component of that. Have you considered doing a socioeconomic impact study on the impact fracking will have on the dairy industry, especially in light of our efforts to increase the important yogurt industry that we have in the state? Because I'm very concerned about how we support agriculture, and there's going to be an impact on the dairy industry. Mm-hmm. Have you explored that?
We certainly looked at it in the generic environmental impact statement. One of the, obviously, a generic environmental impact statement looks at things generally. It's common, conditions, common impacts, and in this case, it's the appropriate mechanism. But we looked at things like agriculture and the potential impact to agriculture. And in fact, there are a handful of very specific mitigation measures that are directed specifically at agriculture to minimize the impacts. It's the limitation of a generic environmental impact statement is that we don't know what sites will actually be developed and where. So when and if this ever goes forward, you have to continue to look at those impacts. One of the things you want to do is make sure that the communities are actually involved, the communities that will know if a well is proposed in a specific place, what those site-specific impacts will be. So this is only, the first stage in the process, if it goes forward. But agriculture is one of the concerns, and Ag and Markets was obviously involved with us from the beginning of the process as well, to try to anticipate and once again mitigate the impacts.
But you could decide to do a socioeconomic impact study.
Well, we did in a generic, at a generic level for a statewide activity. There is a socioeconomic component, a very significant one to the SGIS.
You could be more specific and look at the impact on the agricultural industry or the dairy industry.
We did.
Okay. And when you looked at that, did you take into account there was a study in Pennsylvania that showed that where there was active wells, there was a reduction in the number of cows producing milk?
We did look at that. Once again, we hope it's a little bit like comparing apples to oranges. When there's impacts in Pennsylvania, are under a very specific regulatory regime. We're proposed things that are very different than what has been done. For example, open impoundments are used for flowback water in places. We're not proposing the use of open impoundments. Open impoundments are a problem, and that is one specific possibility for a connection between agricultural impacts. That again, in New York, we wouldn't allow them to be used.
In the health review study that Dr. Shah is looking at, are they looking at the potential negative impact that fracking could have on the food production? Like if there are cows that are near a gas well, if there is a breaker, if there is a tanker that has an accident and fluid from the fracking process or materials that are used in the fracking process are spilled on land and the cows have access to it. Is anyone looking at how those chemicals that are used could potentially be involved in the process of milk production? And is the health impact looking at the impact in that area?
As I said, the emphasis and the approach that we proposed in the SGIS is to prevent exposure. It's to prevent spills. It's secondary containment systems. It's a whole series of things to prevent exposure in the first place. Can you eliminate them? No. Just like you can't eliminate them in many areas.
I'm sorry, I can't hear his answers. Go ahead.
So what the health review is looking at is whether or not the mitigation measures we propose to prevent exposure are adequate or not. That's what they're looking at.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
In terms of the Marcellus shale and the hydrofracking issue, one concern that continues to be raised is the issue of the degradation of the infrastructure in the areas that, if there was the decision to move ahead with the hydrofracking. The heavy equipment that would be used, the well development, perhaps the wastewater disposal. Is there a plan in place to respond to those very real issues which would impact the communities significantly?
Well, what has happened in Pennsylvania and other places is primarily on the transportation front is road use agreements where the companies come in, the locals have control of the local roads, and in New York, a higher percentage of the roads are local roads than state roads that they'd be using. And through these road use agreements, the companies are required to upgrade the roads, maintain the roads, and in many places they've worked very effectively. I can't say that across the board, but it's become a very, very useful tool. But there's lots of impacts to local communities, not just beyond roads. It goes to housing, health services. Lots of different local entities are potentially impacted. And we do discuss those in the SGIS. We talk about the potential revenue stream, if it went forward, that would be available to local governments to fund increases in things like local health departments. But, there's a suite of issues, all of which, again, were discussed in the department's generic environmental impact statement. And I think, in part, a lot of the problems that have happened in other places is that they were literally overwhelmed by the amount of activity. Certainly in New York, we've taken a very conservative, don't do anything until you're ready. And if we proceeded, it would only be very slowly. We are not going to invite thousands of wells into New York simultaneously or overnight. Everyone would have to adapt to this, again, if we went forward.
I'm pleased that the health assessment will be made public. I wonder if there's an opportunity for the public comment on that as well.
I'm sure the public will comment on it.
I'm sure they will, and I hope that their comments are considered seriously as well.
Thank you, Commissioner, for being here today. As a senator who has a district that is right along the Hudson River, I have a great respect for what you and your department do.
Thank you.
I do, however, have questions in regards to the work that you've done on hydraulic fracturing. The SGIS report and the economic assessment report, do you have an estimate of what the work you did on those reports may have cost the taxpayers?
It's in the millions of dollars. I don't have the precise number, but I'm happy to get it for you.
But it's in the high millions of dollars, I would guess. It would be in the high millions, I would guess.
What's high millions?
Well, over 50.
No, I don't think so. No, I think it's millions of dollars. I think it's several $1 million.
Okay. Well, I would think that it would be reasonable to think that for several $1 million, we would be able to have an accurate assessment of what the impacts, the negative impacts of hydraulic fracturing would be on our tourism industry. Mm-hmm. Do you believe that we have that information?
The SGIS did look at impacts on tourism, mostly from anecdotal evidence in Pennsylvania and other places.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. Pennsylvania has a very different tourism industry than New York does. I mean, as you know, it's one of our biggest industries.
Right.
I would expect for the amount of money that we've spent so far, it would be realistic to think that I could go back to my constituents and my tourism organizations and say, this is what the cost of hydrofracking will be on your industry. Do we have that type of information?
It's hard in a generic environmental impact statement to get that level of specificity because we don't know exactly where the activity is going to be undertaken, where the wells will actually be located, or how many wells will actually come into New York.
Well, tourism is just one example. What about for our police and fire departments? Do I have information within this study that allows me to go back to my police and fire departments and educate them on what the cost will be to their budgets with the negative impacts of hydraulic fracturing?
Again, it's mostly anecdotal because the activity hasn't happened in this state. So we do know what's happened in other states, and it's not perfectly analogous because we have a very different set of regulations than have happened in other states.
Excuse me, with all due respect, I'm confused. I would think that the purpose of the report would be to try to estimate what the impacts of the costs on our economy would be. Otherwise, I'm not sure what exactly we're studying in these reports.
It does. In a general way, it does assess those costs.
Well, I've read the reports, and it just seems that it glosses over a lot of these issues that I'm asking about. And I am trying to find significant answers to them. So I appreciate your patience. Also, just in regards to the negative impact on our roads and highways, by reading these reports, there doesn't seem to be a way to calculate what the impact would be on the state's budget for repairing the highways and roads. Do you think that that information is important? Do you think that it might be forthcoming?
Of course it's important. And if we had more specific information about the number of wells and where they were going to be actually located, then we could generate specific information.
Well, I would think within the report you could maybe do some estimates saying if there were 10 wells in this part of the country, it might cost us this much to repair those roads. There would be, it seems like there would be reasonable ways to provide a variety of scenarios, but I just don't see those when I read the report. It seems to be glaringly missing.
It is a generic environmental impact statement. It is not intended to generate specific activity because, once again, we don't know the specifics about how it will or if it will develop in New York.
But there is a 251-page economic assessment report as a part of that, and only 7 pages of that really address any of the issues that I'm talking about right now.
The previous draft.
I appreciate your patience in answering these questions. I just have one more question. Are we clear on exactly what chemicals are in the fracking water?
There is a list, an exhaustive list in the SGIS of the potential chemicals that could be used. I think we list up to 350 chemicals very specifically. Since we haven't fracked a high volume well in New York, we don't know what they would use specifically in New York, but we'd require them to give us that both before and after a frack job.
So if we don't know exactly what chemicals would be used to frack a well in New York, do the scientists that are doing the current health study know what the chemicals are that would be used to frack a well in New York?
Okay, we're going to take a recess very shortly and come back in about 5 hours if you want to do it that way. We're trying to get this done in a productive way. He's answering the questions. If you don't like the answers, you certainly don't have to like them. But at least give him the respect of answering them and the questioner the respect of having the questions asked. I would really appreciate it. Thank you.
The health experts had the SGIS in front of them, which listed all of the potential chemicals that we think could be used in New York State.
Well, I guess my point is I'm trying to determine that in spending the amount of money that we're spending on doing these reports, if we don't know exactly what type of chemicals are going to be used, and if the scientists don't know exactly what type of chemicals are going to be used, then why are we spending millions of dollars to do a report, and how could it be effective if neither the scientists nor your department know exactly what type of chemicals would be used?
We know all the potential chemicals that would be used, and we've listed all of those, and we've enumerated the type of health impacts that are associated with those chemicals. So I'm not sure, again, absent actually having the experience in New York of having a high-volume well fracked, how we could possibly know that. What we do know is in other states what chemicals they use. They would use some subset of the chemicals that are listed in the SGIS. We're talking about an activity that hasn't happened here. So we can only use the information we have from other states. So I'm not sure what you're trying to get at.
I'm just trying to get at how to justify spending this amount of money on a report that isn't actually delivering the results that we need.
I don't agree with that.
But you've already said you don't know exactly what chemicals will be used.
Excuse me a
in the
minute.
fracking
I
process.
think he said quite clearly that he won't know what chemicals a developer might use until an application is presented, and the list that is on the report is an exhaustive list of chemicals that were used in other states. Now, I think he's being very consistent, and I don't think it's correct to try to mischaracterize what he's saying.
Well, I, with all due respect, Mr. Chairman, I'm not trying to mischaracterize it. I'm just trying to get a clear answer. It seems like everything is based on a hypothetical situation of what happens in other states.
We haven't allowed the activity in New York State. That's why it's hypothetical. The activity has happened in a dozen other states, and we use information from those states to anticipate what might happen or be used in New York State. That's about as good as we can do in New York.
Thank you for being here today, and thanks for being patient answering
Thank
my
you.
questions. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Assemblywoman Barbara Lifton. And
Good morning, Commissioner.
Good morning.
Fracking, right? It's, my constituents care about a lot of environmental issues, but these days, the main issue they care about is fracking. It's the main issue I care about.
Yeah.
So I'll direct my questions there. And I want to continue the discussion of this health review that is obviously a big concern for people. And, what bothers me most about some of the questions this morning is that we're sitting here asking you, is the health review dealing with this? Are you looking at this? We don't know what you're looking at. Legislators don't know what you're looking at. And it speaks to it seems to me, and what we've said from the beginning, from the very first comments, that this whole process has made an awful lot of sense, has been built on a very shaky foundation, where in the original scoping document, I think you'll acknowledge, I think you have acknowledged this morning, that health issues are the issues that are paramount here. This is why we really look at environmental issues, because we care about the impact on human health and animal health as well. And yet, many comments, my comments and others, EPA, commented in a very strong way and said, we're not seeing an emphasis here, we're not seeing the issue of health impacts in the first ESCIs. And again, probably because it wasn't in the original scoping document. You weren't there at the time, Commissioner. I don't want to lay that at your doorstep. Don't you think that was a flaw in the original scoping document, that health impact should have been clearly not just insinuated, not just coming at it from some other angle, but what are the potential health impacts in New York, and really start with that. What are the health impacts, so that in the first ESCIs, it's out there for the public to actually look at. Mm-hmm. To date, we have not seen this after 4 years. We have not really seen a document. You're saying there is a document now, after several iterations. There's a document that's been put together at DEC and handed it to DOH, but none of us have seen it.
Right. All that's been handed to DOH are the updates we've done to the ESCIs that went out for public comment. I forget my dates, I'm sorry, some of them, but we put out the last draft in September of 2011. Had a public comment period, obviously took thousands of comments, and have been working on responses to those and changes to the document as a result of lots of public interest. And clearly the expressions of concern about public health caused me to kind of redouble our efforts, go back to the Department of Health and have them look at this document again and involve outside experts. And I have a lot of faith in Dr. Shah personally. I think we've been very responsive to the public's call for a deeper look at this as it affects public health. I would say, though, that I think the SGIS, even the original document that the public saw, while everything in it revolved around impacts to the environment and public health. And as I said, our emphasis from the beginning was always on how do you prevent exposures? How do you keep the chemicals away from the public, whether it's the chemicals that are mixed on site that flow back in the flowback water that ultimately have to go to disposal. We followed the pathways, all the places where there was the potential for exposure, and then we tried to suggest the most aggressive mitigation measures possible to stop that exposure. So while there's lots of things, lots of chemicals that are used in the process, there's potential for impacts if those chemicals are released. So our focus was on don't let them be released. And this is, and we laid out literally dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of mitigation measures that emphasize that. But clearly, after that whole process, the public health community was not satisfied with what we had in the document. They called for a health impact assessment. we feel that the SGIS has been the rough equivalent of a health impact assessment because it involved lots of public input at a variety of stages. We've had 14 public hearings of one sort or another, 4 on scoping, 4 on the draft, 4 on the 2009 draft, 4 more on the 2011 draft. So we've gotten a mountain of public comments, and we've been trying to be responsive to those. We've been working on the responses to comments, and now the Department of Health is reviewing everything we've done, and that will ultimately become a public document that the public can look at again. So I'd rather that the Department of Health, take a look at this, and Dr. Shaw take a look at this and say, have you done enough? Does more need to be done? Are there gaps? And that's what I expect Dr. Shaw to report back to me shortly. So I think we have been responsive to Assemblywoman. I know that, obviously there's plenty of critics, many of them in this room.
True. And with all due respect, Commissioner, you say it was in from the beginning, but EPA came out hitting the DEC very hard on their first comment, saying it's not there. It wasn't there at the beginning. And many comments, and the second round of comments, still people, a great deal of concern, again, from the EPA, not satisfied either. On the health impacts.
We obviously took those comments to heart.
And now, at the end, in the last 4 months, to say we're going to tag something on, a health review, not a real health impact assessment, but a health review done apparently by DEC. Who the DEC had done, you said we put together, I guess you put more stuff in the last document, again, stuff we haven't seen. You put together, because there was still criticism, you put together yet another, or somehow coalesced, took things out and took all this stuff out of the whole document, put it in one other document, 8 pages, as I understand it. And that's the health review. That was sort of the health review done by DEC.
But that's not the health review. The entire SGIS was the health review.
But in order to get a focus on health issues, right? This is what's happened in the last few months. To get a focus on this, here's what we've done. This is what we're going to ask DOH and the outside experts from outside of our state, not the health experts inside New York State, but the health experts that have been brought in from outside to look at. I'm losing my train of thought, but
happens to me frequently.
So my question to you is, I've regained it. My question to you is, so if DEC did that, who is the health expert at DEC? I thought our health experts in doing health assessments or reviews are at DOH, and yet DEC did that. Who is it at DEC that basically put that document together, made the decisions about what it was you had done on health, on mitigating health impacts?
First of all, starting from when I started here, and I can't obviously speak to prior to 2011, so put aside the 2009 draft, but since I've been here, DOH has been at our side. They've reviewed what we've reviewed. They helped draft parts of the SGEIS. So it's not, that DEC has the independent health, we're not writing the health part of this. We wrote it in concert with DOH. So
they're reviewing their own review? I thought you were saying DEC put it together and handed it to DOH to look at.
I asked them to go back and look at it again and involve outside experts, which is exactly what they've done. They went to 3 very good outside experts, and that's who's looking at it. So we did ask DOH to go back and say, take another look at this because of all the concerns that were raised in the response to comments at public hearings. We heard it loud and clear, and that's why I went back to DOH and asked them to do this and asked them to engage outside experts.
Again, with all due respect, Commissioner, it seems like a backwards process, a convoluted process, and it's certainly not a transparent process. It's a process that's been put on at the tail end to avoid some sort of criticism, and it hasn't gone out to full public comment or review. I don't know what you're looking at. I'm a state legislator that's been following this issue for 4 years.
But you will.
As my colleagues. But for comment, it's one thing to look at it. Sure, I understand it's going to be released at the end. Of course it's going to be released at the end. Is the public going to have an opportunity for public comment and review of this,
I'm sure the public
health-
will comment on it.
No, I mean formal public comment. I'm asking a serious
We just
question.
haven't-
Of course, they're going to comment. You know, we know they're deeply concerned about this, as are many of us. Is there going to be legal, public, formal comment on this document, in this health review?
I don't know at this stage. I haven't seen the report yet. The report could include a full range of things. It could, from one end of the spectrum, that no, we're not convinced you've done enough. They could be convinced you've done enough and conclude that it shouldn't happen in New York. That's one possibility. So until I see that, as Assemblywoman, I'm not drawing any conclusions about the need. Even there may be no need for public comment, depending on what Dr. Shah says.
Well, I don't think it's our state law in terms of scoping documents, critical issues, and the necessity of public involvement in that. We have experts all over the state, doctors, researchers, medical people, nurses, who've been looking at this stuff, and they don't get an opportunity to comment specifically on what you're doing. And that doesn't seem good. I think it's a very flawed process that's, to me, unacceptable, and I think unacceptable to the majority of New Yorkers that have been looking at this issue.
Okay.
So my time has run up.
In your testimony, you list out one of the items you're going to spend your $40 million from the New York Works Fund to address legacy, orphaned, and abandoned oil and gas wells. What does that mean, and how much are we spending?
The total is $2 million in the budget. The total in the New York Works program is $2 million. This is for old oil and gas wells that were never properly plugged from before when DEC started regulating oil and gas drilling in New York. So we have hundreds, if not thousands, of old legacy wells that haven't been properly plugged. We have a $100 permit fee that is charged to drillers when they come into New York now that goes into a fund that is supposed to be used to cap and close those old wells. We've made very little progress. That money has been swept historically out of the DEC's budget. So this is in recognition that we need to address those old legacy wells and close them properly. So how many we'll get to with this is an open question, because some may cost $5,000 to close, others may cost $50,000 to close. But we needed a significant sum of money, and $2 million does this, because when we put these RFPs out to close these old wells, unless the type of business person that actually comes and closes these wells can work on a whole slew of them at once, it wasn't worth their while pulling in all the equipment they needed to do a small job. So we put RFPs out, and with the little money we've had in the past to do this, we didn't actually get any bids. So with $2 million, we think we will attract a number of responsive bidders to the RFP, and we'll actually get to close some of these wells.
And if the state were to go forward with hydrofracking, resulting in a large number of wells being drilled, and the research shows that the rate of failure on those wells within a 5-10 year period is pretty high, who would have responsibility for dealing with those wells? Would your agency be responsible for taking care of them under a system like this?
The driller would be responsible for those wells.
So, under state law, those drillers would be responsible?
We think they would, yes.
Okay, if you could get me the statute that you're referencing to ensure that that's the case, because apparently that's not the case for the existing legacy wells.
The existing legacy wells were wells that were drilled before DEC had a regulatory program in place. And drilling has been going on in New York since the late 1800s.
Okay, so you're going to get back to me that there's actually state law and or regulation that it is not the state's
we could require
responsibility.
Things like liability insurance. We can require things through the permitting process that would address any problems at the well.
We don't have a permitting process yet, so I guess my question is, do we have state law that requires that it would be the obligation of the drillers to...
Yes, we have the state law does require wells to be plugged.
And would it there be their
And closed.
responsibility to do environmental cleanup caused by problems with their wells under existing law or statute or regulation?
We could compel them to clean
We
up.
could, but it's not.
We would compel them to
We
clean
would,
up,
but it's
yes.
not existing law yet. I'm sorry, she's shaking her head one way, he's shaking his head the other way.
My executive deputy just confirmed that plugging wells is a requirement under existing law.
I'm sorry, could you say that a little louder? I'm sorry.
Plugging an existing well is required. A closure of a well is required under existing law.
And mediation of environmental damage from a well is covered under existing law?
Go ahead, Mark. You jump in.
Thank you very much. Yes, the plugging requirements in the existing law also have a financial security component, a bonding component, so each well is required to have adequate resources to require the operator to plug, and if the operator doesn't plug, the DEC gets to do that. In terms of any other violations of the Environmental Conservation Law, including Clean Water Act or Clean Air Act, the department has the authority to enforce those provisions.
Quiet, everyone, I'm trying to listen. Sorry.
And so the department has broad authority to enforce each of those laws as it relates to oil and gas activities, whether it's high volume or the traditional historic approach.
When Dr. Shaw was here last week, he was referencing that there's an intention to have some kind of public health surveillance system in place that is some kind of, well, I want to be careful because he said it would be more the responsibility of DEC, but I'm not sure he said it would be totally DEC. Can you tell me what kind of public health surveillance system you have planned if we go forward with hydrofracturing and what we're surveilling?
It really is the Department of Health's surveillance system. They have an existing surveillance system that monitors hospital data, emergency room data, and it's what I've learned recently is it's very extensive. So they would apply that surveillance program if fracking were to go forward in a specific area. Then they would just use the existing system, but focus it on that area to establish whatever the baseline is prior to HV activity, and then see if there's any change in that data as if HVF went forward. So it is a Department of Health surveillance program, and that is not my area of expertise, but Dr.
But what
does.
is your area of expertise would be environmental problems growing.
Right.
So I'm very concerned in my 37 seconds left. What's, for example, your model, your surveillance model for ensuring there are not alarmingly high methane emissions? Because there was a recent study done by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration talking about alarmingly high methane emissions from natural gas extraction. Do you have a system in place for measuring that and the staff to do so?
We would have, we proposed a very extensive monitoring program for emissions generally around a well site so that we can monitor existing conditions and conditions while a job is in progress
Where have you proposed that?
in our SGIS.
And have you estimated the cost for that and how much staffing is required for that?
We have.
And is there any funding for any of those functions in the proposed state budget this year?
There is not.
So we can assume that either nothing will be going forward or you won't be prepared to do that function in the coming 12 months?
As I've said over and over again, we are not going to permit anything we don't have funds to properly monitor and enforce.
Everybody's talking about high-volume hydraulic fracturing. Are any wells being drilled right now in New York State? High-volume hydraulic fracturing wells?
Not high volume.
Is there any funding in this budget for such a process?
No, there isn't.
Okay, thank you.
In the DGIS, there is reference to the possibility of bringing hydrofracking wastewater to wastewater treatment sites on Long Island. I just wonder whether this practice, how this is viewed by yourself. I'm imagining that a truck with wastewater going through the Bronx or Manhattan might fall over, spill its radioactive contents into the subway system, and have a catastrophic negative impact on the economic vitality of our largest state, as well as the health of our population in its greatest concentration. And if a similar accident were to occur on the Long Island Expressway on the way to one of the ocean outfall sites for sewage treatment, that the spillage there would contaminate, because the LIE runs down the groundwater divide, would contaminate our aquifer system, both north and south of the groundwater divide. It just seems like a really important question to ask your opinion on.
As far as I know, the SGIS doesn't specifically mention Long Island. It talks about the possibility of waste going to publicly owned treatment works anywhere in the state, but there is not a single POTW that is permitted to take high volume hydraulic fracturing wastewater today. If a driller wanted to dispose in a POTW, that POTW would have to get an approved pretreatment process permitted by the EPA, because that's not a delegated program in New York, and they would also need to upgrade and update their permit with DEC. In order to do that, they'd need to characterize the waste. They'd have to prove to us that they had a pretreatment process in place that could treat the waste and they'd have to demonstrate that they would meet all of their effluent standards, both federal and state. So the likelihood that fracking wastewater will end up at a POTW, I'd say, is slight, but it's not. If someone went through all of those processes, they got their pretreatment program approved by EPA and DEC, and went through the permitting process, they'd have to characterize the waste, they'd have to demonstrate that pretreatment process could handle the waste, and that they'd meet all effluent standards. It's a very, very high bar.
Would you support legislation that would clarify that we would not permit this practice?
I don't take positions on legislation. All I can tell you, though, if today someone wanted to dispose of it at a POTW, they would have a extraordinarily high bar to get to in order to demonstrate that they could stay in compliance with applicable federal and state permits.
We had recent testimony from the U.S. Geological Survey from a groundwater specialist by the name of John H. Williams, quite an authoritative source. He spoke to the issue of valley fill aquifers in upstate New York. As you probably know, a valley fill aquifer is unconsolidated sediment sitting on bedrock left by glacial processes of the past. And some of these aquifers are quite expansive, very deep. Some of the bedrock has been scoured to great depth. And the valley fill, in many cases, is very deep and full of fresh water. Mr. Williams' testimony said that the valley fill aquifers, I'm quoting now, valley fill aquifers found in upstate New York are the most important aquifers in the state. If we look at the southern tier where shale gas development would be most likely to start, there are approximately 375 linear miles of valley fill aquifers that have not been mapped at a working scale. Thus, a substantial portion of the area where the highest potential for shale gas development exists, there is a lack of basic hydrogeology. That's one of the issues that he raised. He also raised an issue on faults. He said that, quote, faults are of critical importance and may cause the most abrupt changes in formation properties, distribution, and potential effect for fracking. He indicated that Dr. Jacoby, who's a noted professor of structural geology at the University of Buffalo, has studied faults in New York's Appalachian Basin and concluded that they're much more problematic than previously suspected. And so my question to you, we don't have adequate mapping of faults. We don't have adequate mapping, according to the USGS, on a working scale of valley fill aquifers in the most likely area for hydrofracking. And so I ask you, how do you reconcile this with the almost complete absence of addressing these issues in the DGIS?
In the SGIS, the regulatory name of those valley flow aquifers are principal and primary aquifers, which I know you're familiar with. And we, at least in the draft, had proposed a ban on drilling in primary aquifers, which are used by municipalities around the state as their primary water supply. And that for principal aquifers, a driller would have to do a site-specific environmental impact statement if they wanted to drill in a principal aquifer, which is used by many fewer people than primary aquifers are. And those aquifers are well mapped. I think you can probably see where they are if you go to our website, but I can be happy to share the data we have on where they're located. Industry has, just to give you the other side, their perspective is we ought to allow drilling within both primary and principal aquifers. They've done it in other places. So I hear obviously both sides of that equation, but we've taken a very aggressive posture as it applies to principal and primary aquifers. And on faults, I can't cite you chapter and verse, but where there's any evidence of faults, that there are seismic tools that could be applied for drilling in areas which do indicate where faults are. And I think, again, when we would require seismic testing, I can't recall specifically, but in those areas where we think it's of concern, we can require testing before drilling occurs. So I think we have addressed at least both those areas, and I'd be happy to go back and see what else we have, particularly with seismology, because I just can't recall off the top of my head everything that's in the SGIS.
The logic that you just put forward for doing further investigation before going forward, it seems to me, is good logic, but that it should be applied to the 375 linear miles of valley fill aquifers before this whole process is even given a green light to proceed. But thank you for your comments this morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next question is, I come off of a school board, so schools are of particular interest to me. My understanding is that 68 of our public schools across the state have either active or abandoned oil or natural gas wells on the school property. And I understand that New York allows the gas wells on the property. However, there is some understanding that the invasive, the practice of high-volume hydraulic fracking would not be allowed on school grounds. If that's true, though, can you just comment for me, if you will, or give us a little more on the proposed buffer zones on those schools in particular, and what you propose to do and how you would distance that ability from our school property, especially with those good few dozen schools? Thank you.
Our current setback? The current setback from structures like schools and public buildings is 500 feet. And that's the existing setback, and we don't allow high-volume hydraulic fracturing to occur yet in New York, so that activity, hasn't happened on school grounds or elsewhere. We are, I think, proposing an increase to 1,000 feet in the current draft of the SGIS from schools.
Okay. This is one I'm sure I'd welcome another conversation as I begin to learn these issues. Really appreciate your comments.
Yep,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Next is Assemblywoman Lifton to close, actually. And we have with us, join us, Assemblywoman Hooper. Yes.
Yes. Did you say to close?
Yes.
Mr. Chair? Just two quick questions, Commissioner. I don't know, I've lost track. We've been in a number of hearings together. One hearing a year or so ago, I asked if there was a demonstration project. I said there were rumors of a demonstration project in the southern tier. And I said, is there a plan? Are you aware of a plan to roll out gas drilling in the southern tier with some sort of smaller project? You said no, you were not aware of such a plan. Next day, there was a press report. There was indeed such a plan being put forward, I think, by Shenango County that went to the hydrofracking panel, of which you chair. No? But
I recall the press announcement, but it was just that. I read it in the press.
You were not, a year ago, that plan wasn't presented to the hydrofracking panel for possible review by that panel a year ago? For a few test wells and
representative from Shenango
hydraulic.
may have suggested it at an advisory committee meeting. I'm not.
They did a whole assessment of what potentially
would be. Mark just reminded me that we had the county came in and made a presentation about all the things that the county were doing to prepare for high-volume hydraulic fracturing. We spent most of the session on the things that they had done on the county level to prepare a plan to anticipate the activity.
Commissioner, is there now a plan to roll out 10 to 40 wells? We keep hearing, again, a lot of discussion about that. Is there a current plan at DEC or somewhere else on the local level anything that you're aware of to begin to roll out drilling in the southern tier?
A demonstration project is one of the alternatives that's considered in the alternatives chapter of the SGIS, along with 6 other alternatives, I think.
And let me, if I could just finish with this. You say you've been looking at other states. We have too, of course, looking especially closely at Pennsylvania. And I don't know if you're aware, but I'm told, and from pretty reliable sources and up-close sources, that there are 400 families in one county alone that have been had water delivered to them for the last 2 years. They've been living on delivered water for 2 years. 400 families in one county, Washington County, Pennsylvania. That's just one huge concern that I have out of Pennsylvania. There are lots of concerns, of course, and there are people all over Pennsylvania with water hurt. We don't have good data because they're all signing non-disclosure agreements, of course, in order to get that water. Also, Pennsylvania, as you may know, passed Act 13. Pennsylvania law that put a part of which put a gag on doctors to talk about health concerns, to talk about people's symptoms, to share information with other doctors, and to try to get a better handle on what's happening with their patients. I'm greatly concerned when I hear that kind of thing. To me, this industry has a record of incompetence, malfeasance, and in the case of Pennsylvania Law 13, where they put a gag order on doctors, which of course doctors are in court fighting, it's against their Hippocratic oath to not try to do the best they can by their patients. So to me that's a corruption, and I assume it's the industry, not the citizens of the state of Pennsylvania who lobbied their legislature to say doctors can't talk to each other and they can't share information. I assume that push came from the industry. And that makes me extremely uncomfortable in terms of inviting this industry into New York State. Do you feel uncomfortable, Commissioner, when you hear that kind of thing out of Pennsylvania? to say we ought to allow this industry into the state of New York. That level of corruption that we've seen there, and that's just one instance, Commissioner, I'm very uncomfortable. Does it make you uncomfortable to hear these kind of things out of Pennsylvania?
I'm uncomfortable anytime I hear about corporate irresponsibility, whether it's with regards to this industry or any other.
To me, these are disqualifiers. You know, to say doctors can't talk to each other. This is just unheard of, isn't it, in our state, in our country? To me, it says these people don't want us to know what's really going on with this industry and what impact it has on real people and their real lives every day, and especially on water and human health. The industry isn't safe, in my view, Commissioner. Where are you on your overall thinking about that? When you look at Pennsylvania and everything we're hearing, how do you feel about it? You say you're uncomfortable. What do you think about doctor's gag order in Pennsylvania? Why are they doing that? Why do you, when you
I
hear
feel the
that,
same
have
way
you heard
about
that,
doctors'
Commissioner?
gag orders as you do, Assemblywoman.
And how does it make you assess the industry when you hear something like that? How do you feel about saying, let's invite them into New York?
Listen, I'm afraid that anything I say here will be taken out of context. Case in point.
I want to hear your answer, Commissioner.
I don't think it's fair in any sector to categorically condemn everybody that's in an industry for the behavior of some companies. Clearly, some companies have not been responsible when it comes to high volume hydraulic fracking. You could say that with regard to lots of different industries. There's charlatans in the healthcare industry. There's charlatans in the petroleum industry generally. Well, if the question is, can you properly regulate them? Can you force responsible companies to operate in New York? And that's an open question. What I'm concerned about is whether or not someone could operate in New York in a way that protects public health and the environment. That's my concern. And
again, Commissioner, with all due respect, I don't think the state of Pennsylvania, as corrupt as it clearly is around this industry, is responding to one rogue company. They are responding, I believe, to the industry as a whole that wants to put a kibosh on real information getting out to people. I can't believe the state of Pennsylvania listened to one or two businesses, one or two mom and pop operations, and said, sure, we'll agree to a gag order on doctors. That doesn't seem credible to me. Thank you, Commissioner, very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, all right, folks. Are you going to stay here till 5 o'clock tonight with us? Not tonight. Thank you, Commissioner. Folks. Hold it, all right. Folks, you're making it hard for me to call a 10 o'clock person. If you want to come back at 6, you can continue what you're doing. Okay, good. Rose Harvey, Commissioner, New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. Ms. Harvey?